The story begins when Karen Johnson moved into our Willow Creek Estates neighborhood. From the moment she set foot here, everyone felt an ominous chill creeping in. Willow Creek had always been peaceful, where neighbors minded their own business and lived in harmony like a full bowl of water. But the instant Mrs. Johnson arrived, that peace vanished like soap bubbles. Within less than a week, she had bombarded the Homeowners Association, HOA, with a flurry of complaint letters, as if she'd been appointed the neighborhood's new police chief. 2 neighboring houses were hit first. The Hendersons got fined for their obnoxious trash bin sitting out front, even though it had been there for over a decade without a single complaint. Then there was the poor basketball hoop at the Petersons, set up ages ago for the kids to play, which she zeroed in on as a violation and demanded be taken down immediately. And that wasn't all. Even the wind chimes at Mrs. Garcia's, with their familiar, soothing jingles that were a hallmark of Willow Creek, were deemed too noisy by her and ordered to be removed entirely. Good heavens, in just a few days, she'd turned this once tranquil neighborhood upside down. Everyone frowned, shook their heads, and sighed in exasperation. As for me, I just thought to myself, well, that's it. Trouble's brewing in our little corner. Still, I figured I might dodge her radar for the first few months. I'm known as one of the most meticulous homeowners in Willow Creek when it comes to keeping my house and garden in top shape. Not because I'm scared of the HOA's silly rules, but because I take pride in my home and love everything to be neat and perfect. One Tuesday morning in April, I was swamped with a Zoom call with some demanding clients. Suddenly, a strange noise drifted in from the back of the house. At first, I tried to ignore it, convincing myself it was just someone's lawnmower. But no, the mechanical whirring, buzzing, and grinding grew louder, inching closer to my property. Unable to focus anymore, I apologized to the clients, muted my mic, and rushed out back to investigate. And the sight that greeted me, I swear, I nearly had a heart attack on the spot. There was Karen Johnson, that difficult new neighbor, standing bold as brass in my backyard, wielding a chainsaw. She was struggling to take down my ancient oak tree, the massive, majestic oak that had stood like a living monument for over a century. On closer inspection, I saw she'd only managed to carve a shallow gash into the bark, probably because she lacked the strength, and the saw was too big for her. But her intent was as clear as day. My blood boiled, but I took a deep breath, striving to keep my voice as calm as possible, and asked, "Excuse me, Mrs. Johnson, what exactly are you doing in my yard?" She jerked her head up, looking as nonchalant as if she'd been caught watering her own plants instead of vandalizing someone else's property. She switched off the chainsaw and flashed a fake smile, the kind that didn't even reach her eyes. "Oh, it's you, David. Good morning. I'm just handling this tree situation here," she said, waving a hand toward my oak as if it were some piece of trash rather than a historic treasure. Tree situation? I raised an eyebrow, stepping closer, my tone dripping with sarcasm. "With all due respect, Mrs. Johnson, there's no tree situation here. This is my oak on my land, and you're trespassing." She smirked, as if I just told her a lame joke. "Oh, please! According to HOA Rule 47.8, trees over 40 feet are prohibited in Willow Creek Estates because they pose a storm damage risk. I measured your oak, and it's at least 50 feet tall. No kidding. I'm doing this for the community, you know." I took a deep breath, struggling to rein in the fury bubbling up inside me. "Mrs. Johnson, first of all, there's no such thing as Rule 47.8. I know the HOA handbook by heart. Second, even if there were, you have no right to barge into my yard and start cutting down my tree. You're not the HOA police, and even a real HOA officer would follow proper procedures, not act like some vigilante." Her smile froze for a split second, then blossomed again, even brighter. "Oh, I forgot to mention. I'm the new HOA president. The election was last week. You'd have known if you'd bothered to show up." That news hit me like a thunderbolt. But even if she were the president of the United States, she had no right to waltz in and destroy my property like this. Even if you are the HOA president, I gritted my teeth. You can't just storm into someone's home and do whatever you please. This is illegal trespassing and property damage, Mrs. Johnson. I demand you leave my yard immediately, or I'm calling the police. The police? She sneered, clutching her chest as if deeply offended. Good grief. It's just about enforcing community standards, and you're threatening to call the cops. You're overreacting, David. That tree is dangerous, an eyesore, and it drops leaves all over my yard every fall. Your yard is 3 houses away and across the street, Mrs. Johnson. I pointed at her, my patience finally snapping. And yes, trees shed leaves. That's nature, get it? She picked up the chainsaw again, her tone challenging. Well, I've already started, so why don't I finish the job? The HOA board voted on it. This month, we're dealing with all. The oversized trees. Yours is just the first casualty. That was the last straw. I whipped out my phone and dialed 911. I'm calling the police, Mrs. Johnson. This is your final chance to leave. Perhaps my firm, unyielding tone convinced her I wasn't bluffing. At last, she lowered the chainsaw. Fine, she pouted. But watch out, David. You'll get an official violation notice, and the fines will pile up daily. This isn't over! She glared at me with a scorching look, then grudgingly packed up and stormed off. Her bobbed blonde hair twitched with every resentful step. The moment she disappeared from my yard, I called John, my best friend and go-to real estate dispute lawyer. As soon as I finished recounting the whole saga, John leapt up. That woman's beyond help, David. You need to document everything. The saw mark on the tree, any signs she trespassed. Report it to the police immediately. Oh, and get security cameras installed, just in case she tries anything else. Right after hanging up with John, I followed his advice to the letter. I snapped photo after photo of the glaring chainsaw mark on the oak and the suspicious footprints on my lawn. Less than half an hour later, my doorbell rang shrilly again. Opening it, I found a crisp white envelope stamped with the HOA logo. What now? I muttered, a bad feeling creeping in. Tearing it open, I pulled out a sheet covered in dense text with the bold underlined title, Violation Notice, glaring, like a court summons. Reading it, I could barely stifle a laugh. The so-called official notice parroted that fictitious Rule 47.8 of hers and slapped me with a $600 fine, plus $120 per day, until the violation was resolved. Her signature, Deborah Johnson, HOA president, loomed large, dominating the page. Refusing to entertain this farce, I fired off an email to the entire HOA board, attaching her ridiculous notice and recounting the morning's failed tree-chopping episode in detail. I also demanded they provide the minutes from the latest meeting to verify if there'd been any vote on handling oversized trees, as she claimed. Within hours, my inbox flooded with replies. Everyone expressed shock and confusion. Turns out, there'd been no vote on trees. Some board members were even baffled, unaware of how Mrs. Johnson had climbed to HOA president. Just then, my phone buzzed. It was Robert Smith, the real HOA president for the past 4 years, his deep, familiar voice on the line. David, I have no idea what Mrs. Johnson is up to, but she's definitely not the HOA president. We had our quarterly meeting last week. But the presidential election isn't until November. She only recently joined the landscaping committee. And yet, hearing Mr. Smith's explanation, the pieces started falling into place. Mrs. Johnson was just a minor landscaping committee member who'd deluded herself into thinking she was president and granted herself the power to dictate others' trees. Mr. Smith reassured me that her violation notice was null and void and would be cancelled immediately. He also promised to call an emergency board meeting to deal sternly with this power-hungry woman. The next morning, my new security camera system arrived. I spent the whole day installing them everywhere, focusing on the backyard and my beloved oak. I also called a tree expert to assess the damage Mrs. Johnson had caused and appraise my oaks, value for future legal action. That afternoon, Dr. Lee, the arborist I'd contacted, examined the chainsaw mark on the oak. You're lucky she didn't go deeper, he said. "This is just a scratch. No long-term harm to the tree." But if she'd cut a few more inches, it could have weakened, making it prone to snapping in a storm. When I asked about the tree's value, his answer left me stunned. "This is a white oak, over a century old and in its prime. Its worth is at least $50,000. In wealthier neighborhoods, rare trees like this can fetch double that." That information was priceless. It not only confirmed that Mrs. Johnson's actions could be a criminal offense, but also fueled my resolve to protect my oak at all costs. That night, I got a call from Officer Davis, who'd visited earlier. "Mr. Miller, we've spoken with Mrs. Johnson about this morning's incident. She insisted she had the right to enforce community standards as HOA president. But when we verified with the real president, she clammed up and refused to cooperate." "So, what, now?" I asked, my heart racing. "We've warned her about illegal trespassing and intentional property damage. We made it clear that if she sets foot on your property or harms your oak again, she'll be arrested on the spot. The district attorney's office is reviewing the case to decide if she'll face charges for the earlier damage." Hearing Officer Davis, I felt a bit relieved, though an uneasy feeling lingered. My gut told me this wasn't over yet. The next few days passed eerily quietly. Mrs. Johnson's house stayed lit, with cars coming and going, but she didn't contact me or anyone else as far as I knew. The HOA held an emergency meeting, officially reprimanding her and stripping her of her unofficial landscaping committee role. 5 days after the failed tree chopping incident, I woke to the patter of rain outside my window. An unexpected spring storm had rolled in, with winds howling so fiercely that my front porch planters toppled over. All morning, I darted around the yard, securing loose items and climbing onto the roof to check the gutters. By noon, the sky darkened, and with a loud pop, my power went out. The electric company said a fallen tree had hit a power line nearby, and crews were working on it. Bored and restless indoors, I decided to drive around the neighborhood to see if anyone else had storm damage. Turning onto Oak Street, I spotted a small crowd gathered in front of a house, Mrs. Karen Johnson's. At first, I thought she was staging another attention-grabbing stunt, but as I got closer, the truth hit me. A massive ancient pine tree from her front yard had crashed down, smashing a section of her roof. The scene was chaotic. Part of the ILOS roof caved in, with rainwater surely pouring inside. I pulled over and joined the curious onlookers. Kind neighbor Sarah spotted me and pulled me aside, spilling the details. "That pine's been dead for 3 years. The previous owner planned to have it removed, but sold the house to Mrs. Johnson before it happened. She refused to pay for its removal, despite everyone warning her how dangerous it was." Hearing Sarah, I could only shake my head. Talk about what goes around comes around. Mrs. Johnson had aggressively targeted my healthy oak as a hazard, yet ignored the real danger, a rotting pine, right in her own yard. The irony was laughable. As I stood there, dazed by the wreckage, I caught a glimpse of Mrs. Johnson in her yard. Dressed in a raincoat, she was flailing her arms, arguing loudly with a firefighter. From a distance, I could tell she was in a full-blown tantrum. I turned to leave, not wanting to kick her while she's down, or rub salt in her wounds, especially not with someone as insufferable as her. But just as I reached my car, she spotted me. Her eyes flashed with rage, and she charged through the muddy lawn toward me. "It's your fault! This is all because of you!" she shrieked, her voice piercing through the rain and wind. "You did this!" I was speechless, frozen for a moment, unable to believe my ears. "Excuse me, Mrs. Johnson. What did you just say?" I stammered, as if I'd misheard. "How could the dead tree falling on your house be my fault? You're behind." "All this!" she yelled, her shrill voice cutting through the storm. "You snitched to the city about my tree to get back at me, didn't you?" She jabbed a finger at my chest, nearly poking me in the face. "I know it was you who reported." My tree, wasn't it? Good grief. I wanted to burst out laughing at her wild, delusional accusations. What kind of logic was that? Did she think I had superpowers to control trees and weather just to spite her over the failed oak incident? She was beyond help. What? She reported it herself? I gaped, incredulous. True, Mr. Smith confirmed, his voice still tinged with disbelief. When she first started pushing her Titan neighborhood standards agenda, she filed complaints against every house, leaving no one out, including her own. She probably thought if everyone got fined, the board would rubber stamp her plan. But the city got involved, investigated a bunch of violations around the neighborhood. All trivial, except hers, which actually got her in trouble. Hearing Mr. Smith's account, I could only shake my head and chuckle. Talk about hoist with her own petard. Her scheme had backfired spectacularly. A week passed, and life in Willow Creek slowly returned to normal. My new security cameras kept vigilant watch day and night, but Mrs. Johnson never came near. The saw mark on my oak was healing, sap oozing like blood from a mending wound. I thought the drama had finally ended, though I'd overheard whispers from neighbors about her house still being a mess from repairs and her growing more isolated in her shell of unpleasantness. Then, one beautiful Sunday morning, with birds chirping outside my window, I heard a gentle knock at the door. Opening it, I found Officer Davis standing there, his face grave as if delivering bad news. Good morning, Mr. Miller. I'm afraid. I have some unpleasant news for you, he said, his voice low. May I come in? I quickly invited him inside and brewed him a hot cup of coffee. We sat across from each other at the kitchen table as he slowly recounted the story. Last night, around 1 a.m., Mrs. Wilkins was arrested for intentional property damage and illegal trespassing. I sat there, stunned, unable to process it. She came back? After everything? Officer Davis nodded, his expression helpless. Yes, a neighbor heard a chainsaw and called 911. We arrived and caught Mrs. Wilkins red-handed, trying to cut down your oak again. This time she'd sawed nearly halfway through the trunk. My stomach twisted. The oak. How's my... Oak? Officer Davis sighed heavily. We had city arborists assess it. They concluded the trees suffered too much damage to save. Its structure is compromised and could become a hazard any time. A wave of pain and loss washed over me. That oak was one of the main reasons I bought this house. Its shade, the birds it sheltered, and above all, its status as a historic symbol of endurance I deeply cherished. Mrs. Wilkins is in custody, Officer Davis continued, pulling me back to the harsh reality. Given the severe damage she caused, plus prior warnings, she's facing felony charges. The district attorney's considering prosecuting her for the earlier failed attempt, too, since this is a repeat offense. I nodded, my heart heavy, still reeling from the shocking news. So, what happens next? We'll need you at the station to give a statement. You might have to testify if the case goes to trial. But there's a bit of consolation. Officer Davis added gently, your homeowner's insurance should cover the cost of removing the damaged tree and possibly planting a new one. Plus, you can sue Mrs. Wilkins civilly for the full value of the tree. After Officer Davis left, I wandered out to the backyard, like a lost soul to see the heartbreaking evidence for myself. The sight shattered my heart into pieces. My beloved oak was now a battered wreck. The deep gash had nearly severed half the trunk, exposing the stark white core. The upper branches sagged, leaves yellowing and wilting as if crying out in agony. Bright yellow caution tape encircled the area, amplifying the bleak, mournful scene. Standing there, rooted to the spot in my ravaged garden, I noticed shadowy figures of neighbors peeking over the fence. Their murmurs grew louder. Then, one by one, they approached, gathering around my yard. Each face bore sadness and sympathy, as if they'd lost a loved one too. Even those I barely knew came to pat my shoulder, offering comfort. It felt as though that oak wasn't just mine, but a vital part of Willow Creek's soul. Kind-hearted Jessica stepped up, rallying everyone to start a neighborhood watch on the spot. People eagerly volunteered, taking shifts to patrol and guard, not just my home, but the entire neighborhood again's. As the crowd dispersed, I sat alone at home, my mind a tangle of emotions. Then the doorbell rang again. This time, it was a middle-aged man in a sleek black suit. He introduced himself as Richard Johnson, Karen's ex-husband. "Hello, Mr. Miller. I'm Richard Johnson, Deborah's ex-husband," he said, his voice laced with regret. "I'm here to apologize for her unacceptable actions. I heard about it from the kids, but I never imagined it would escalate this far until—" I got word of her arrest. I stared at him, unsure how to react. Richard Johnson, Karen's ex. What was he doing here? "I'm not here to excuse her behavior," Richard continued sincerely. "What Deborah did to your oak was utterly wrong and unforgivable. But I want you to know she's been struggling with mental health issues since our divorce 3 years ago. That doesn't justify her actions, but it might help you understand a little." I listened quietly, still skeptical. "I get it," I replied, cautiously, but this has gone far beyond typical neighbor disputes, Mr. Johnson. Mrs. Wilkins destroyed a century-old tree, an irreplaceable asset." He nodded, his face heavy. "I completely understand. I'm not asking you to drop any charges or claims. In fact, I've contacted your lawyer and offered to cover all costs, tree removal, damages, everything, as part of a settlement. Deborah might not be able to pay, but I want to make this right." His unexpected offer caught me off guard. "You're incredibly generous," I said, a bit flustered. "This is the least I can do," Richard replied, pulling a business card from his pocket. "And one more thing. This is the contact for a tree specialist. He works at a nursery specializing in rare tree propagation. They have young white oaks grown from seeds of trees like yours. They're only about 15 years old, nothing compared to your century-old oak, but it's a start. If you're interested, he can help you pick one to replant." I took the card, a wave of complex emotions washing over me. "Thank you," I said earnestly. "I'll definitely reach out." Watching Richard's black SUV disappear beyond the gate, I felt a weight lift from my shoulders. Nothing could bring back my ancient oak, but the idea of planting a young one, a descendant of a rare lineage, sparked hope, a sense of continuity, and healing. The legal proceedings against Mrs. Johnson unfolded with breathtaking speed. The evidence was ironclad: security footage of her sneaking into my yard at midnight, countless witness statements, and her own fiery threats from before. It all stacked against her. Finally, she had to swallow her pride and accept a bitter plea deal. The terms were harsh. She'd pay me a hefty sum to cover the tree damage, legal fees, and my emotional distress. She was also ordered to perform extensive community service, undergo mandatory mental health therapy, and serve a strict probation. The most crushing blow: she had to sell her dream house in Willow Creek and was banned from ever returning or contacting any resident here again. 5 months after that horrific chainsaw night, a small crowd gathered in my backyard. The remnants of the ancient oak had been cleared, its stump dug up and tidied. In its place, a vibrant 12-year-old oak sapling was gently lowered into a prepared hole. Though not tiny, it paled in grandeur compared to its century-old predecessor. The tree specialist Richard recommended personally selected the healthiest sapling from his nursery and oversaw the entire planting process, ensuring every detail was perfect. Once again, kind Jessica took charge, orchestrating a warm tree warming party. Neighbors arrived with salads, homemade desserts, and fresh fruit platters. The kids buzzed around, crafting quirky decorations and hanging them on the garden fence, filling the air with joy and laughter. HOA President Robert Smith presented me with a polished bronze plaque to hang by the new oak. Engraved on it was a tribute to the lost tree and a testament to Willow Creek's unity during these trying times. As everyone raised their glasses to toast the sapling, I stood amidst the warm embrace of friends and neighbors, my heart swelling with emotion. Reflecting on the tumultuous 6 months, I marveled at life's unexpected turns. A woman I barely knew had declared war on my oak, and by extension, my peaceful existence. Her actions caused irreparable loss, yet ironically, she'd unwittingly forged something priceless. A true sense of community. A Willow Creek more united than ever. To new beginnings, I toasted, gazing at the sapling reaching for the sun. To strong roots! Cheers echoed through the garden, blending with the lively chatter. The afternoon sun filtered through the sapling's tender leaves, casting dappled shadows on my friends' radiant faces. In that moment, an unusual peace enveloped my soul. Karen Johnson had tried to destroy a timeless beauty, but in the end, she only made our Willow Creek community stronger and more resilient. Like that young oak, battered by storms yet standing tall, it would grow, thrive, and endure for generations. And there you have it, folks. My oak tree saga. Looking back, it was one heck of a close call. But after all the drama, I realized how amazing my Willow Creek neighborhood truly is. Karen, with her difficult ways, tried to divide us and turn this place into chaos. But instead, she unintentionally brought us closer together. Talk about hoist with her own petard. Oh, while we're on the HOA topic, let me share a little tip for everyone to stay prepared. These homeowners associations can be a bit of a hassle, sure, but they do have their reasons. HOAs exist to keep our neighborhoods tidy and beautiful, with everyone accountable to shared rules. But here's the key. HOAs can set rules, but they can't do whatever they please. The U.S. legal system, with its federal and state laws, including the Americans with Disabilities Act, ADA, and property rights laws, keeps them in check. Like Karen, who thought she was the law, ruling as she saw fit. But even the sun sets, and her made-up HOA rules eventually unraveled. In the end, she paid the price for her overreach. From this ordeal, I've gleaned some hard-earned lessons to share. First, always stick together. One tree doesn't make a forest, 3 trees together form a mountain. When faced with injustice, don't go it alone. Lean on your neighbors, pool your strength and spirit, and no challenge is too great. Second, know your rights. Don't be clueless about laws or regulations, letting others lead you by the nose. If unsure, consult a lawyer. Prevention is better than cure. You never know when that knowledge might protect you and your family. And finally, never stay silent against injustice. Speak out when you see wrong. Fight back when oppressed. Silence only lets evil grow bolder. So, if you ever find yourself in a laugh or cry situation like mine, harassed by an HOA, stay calm and fight back. Keep every piece of evidence, emails, texts, photos, videos. If needed, get a lawyer. And most importantly, don't stand alone. Rise with your neighbors to defend your rights. Where there's a will, there's a way. And with persistence, justice will prevail. That's the end of my story, everyone. I hope you enjoyed this little heart-to-heart video. If you found it entertaining or helpful and want to motivate me to share more tales, drop a 1 in the comments below. See you in the next video.